She wasn't just cheating, she was planning to strip me of everything I had worked for too. I was accused at work of a colleague's mistake, and when I came home and found out that my wife was cheating on me, I packed my things and left to get revenge. After a rough week at work, where my boss unfairly blamed me for someone else's mistake, I arrived home to find my driveway blocked by my sister-in-law, Linda's car. Frustrated, I had to park a few houses away because the street was lined with cars. Linda and I had never been on good terms, so seeing her didn't improve my mood. My relationship with my wife Mary hadn't been great lately either. It had been almost a month since we were last intimate. I dragged the empty trash can around to the side of the house, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and headed to the living room. As I approached, I heard Mary and Linda chatting. Just as I was about to enter, I overheard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. "We did it 3 times today, he's a machine," I heard Mary say. I didn't know who Linda was referring to, but my heart sank when I heard my wife say, "Ever since Tony came back last month, I just can't get enough of him." Tony was Mary's ex-boyfriend who had left town years ago. My mind raced as I pieced together what was happening. "So, what's your plan now?" Linda asked. "I'm getting a lawyer and filing for divorce," Mary replied nonchalantly. "Since this is a community property state, I'll get half of everything." I couldn't listen anymore. It hit me like a ton of bricks that the reason for our intimacy was because she was with someone else. Worse still, she was already planning to take half of everything I owned, and the law would likely give it to her. Mary and I had been married for 4 years. She quit her job shortly after our wedding and did very little around the house, while I paid for a maid and handled most of the cooking. Despite this, I'd been blinded by love. I inherited nearly $3 million after my parents passed away. And while it was a significant amount, it wasn't extraordinary compared to today's wealthy elite. I kept the money invested untouched, despite Mary's constant attempts to spend it all. I also had an extra $150,000 and saved. But stupidly, I didn't have a prenuptial agreement, meaning Mary could take nearly $1.5 million from me. Realizing she hadn't served me with divorce papers yet, I knew I had some time to act. I waited for Linda to leave, then went back into the house, grabbed another beer, and began devising a plan. When I got home later that night, Mary greeted me in the kitchen, mentioning she hadn't ordered dinner. I played along, determined to show her I could be just as calculating as she was. She went to take a bath while I heated up leftovers, drank a few beers, and settled into watching a movie, all the while planning my next move. Over the weekend, I kept myself busy with yard work and golf, knowing I couldn't act until Monday. That day, I called my broker to liquidate all my investments, including my 401k, despite the penalties. By Thursday, I was ready to leave. I told Mary I had to fly out on urgent business for a week. I packed only 2 suitcases, planning to take nothing more. Everything important to me had already been stored away since it didn't match her taste in decor. We were renting, so there was no money tied up in the house, and I had already sold my condo. We had been searching for the perfect house, but nothing ever met her standards. Early Friday morning, I left home for good, giving my wife a final kiss on the cheek. I packed my suitcases into my BMW and drove off without looking back. My first stop was to see my trusted friend Mike, where I swapped my BMW for his older 4-wheel drive. I shared my plans with him, and he agreed to keep my car hidden for the next few days. I paid for everything in cash, having canceled all our credit cards to avoid leaving a paper trail. Most of my money was safely in an offshore account, with a system in place to transfer funds as needed. I also kept enough cash in the SUV to last for a while. The nights alone in motels were tough. I'd been too busy executing my plan to dwell on my personal situation, but now that everything was in motion, I had time to think. I genuinely loved Mary, but now I realized she likely didn't love me back, seeing me only as a financial provider. On the 5th day, while sitting in a small town diner in Colorado, I overheard an older couple discussing their financial struggles. The man, in his late 50s with mostly gray hair, and his striking red-haired wife, were talking about how they couldn't afford to hire help until their cats were ready for market, and even then, the wages they could offer were too low to attract workers. After finishing my meal, I approached the couple's table and offered to help, explaining that I only needed a place to stay in exchange for work. The old man asked me to step outside for a private conversation. He was fit and rugged, clearly accustomed to hard work. He questioned my motives, concerned that I might be running from the law or involved with a group trying to pressure him into selling his land. I assured him that I wasn't a criminal, just someone trying to protect what was rightfully mine after my unfaithful wife attempted to take everything I had. I needed a place to stay and was willing to work in exchange, covering my own expenses and leaving if I wasn't useful. After considering my story, he warned me about the potential trouble from those trying to buy his land, but agreed to give me a chance. He asked about my ranch experience, and I admitted to having some, though I wasn't a seasoned cowboy. We shook hands, and Jim introduced himself. Back inside the diner, I met his wife Maggie, who welcomed me warmly. She had a slight Irish accent, and both she and Jim were fit and attractive. Jim suggested I follow him to the ranch and stop at a general store to buy suitable clothes for ranch work. I appreciated his foresight and picked up enough gear to last the week. The drive to the Rocking J Ranch was about 25 miles. The property was well maintained, with a 2-story house, a barn, and several outbuildings. After helping unload groceries, Jim directed me to a small cabin where I could stay. The cabin was basic but clean, with a bed, table, wood stove, and bathroom. It wasn't luxurious, but it was a safe place to stay, away from Mary's reach. When I stepped outside, Jim invited me into his pickup truck for a tour of the ranch. He owned nearly 4,500 acres, with 3,500 ideal for grazing, and a few hundred acres dedicated to growing winter feed. The back part of the ranch was hilly, wooded, and accessible only by horseback, with mountains visible in the distance. Jim used to have 3 full-time workers, but now only Sam remained, who had worked on the ranch for nearly 25 years. During roundup seasons, Jim hired additional help. He dropped me off at the cabin at 5 o'clock and mentioned that I could connect to the internet wirelessly. I unpacked quickly, set up my computer, and checked my email. Mike had informed me that Mary had reported me missing to the police, who were investigating. Mike was the only person who knew I had left, and even he didn't know my destination at the time. I had sent my resignation to my old job without informing them in person. Just before 6 o'clock, I headed to the main house, where Jim welcomed me in. Maggie was setting the table, and Jim introduced me to Sam, a strong man around Jim's age. We sat down for a hearty dinner of pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, and homemade biscuits. During the meal, Jim shared that the ranch had been in his family for generations and spoke fondly of his daughter Tina, who was finishing her doctorate and would soon return home. After dinner, I offered to help with the dishes, but Maggie declined. Jim reminded me that breakfast was at 5:30 and work started at 6 o'clock. Before leaving, I borrowed the front page of the local newspaper and later had Sam take a photo of me holding it. I emailed the photo to Mike, asking him to forward it to the police, explaining I had left on my own, hoping to avoid being listed as missing. That night, I slept soundly. The next morning, I woke early, joined Sam for breakfast, and was assigned to replace fence posts in the hills. Sam guided me to the barn, where I saddled a brown mare, and we loaded supplies onto 2 mules. Jim handed me a rifle for emergencies, and we set off along the creek into the hills. As we rode, Sam and I got to know each other better. Sam talked about his own past, revealing that he had married right after high school and found his ex-wife with another man. In a fit of anger, he had nearly beaten the man to death and served 5 years in prison. Upon his release, Jim was the only one who would offer him a job. The mountains were stunning in the morning light, with snow on the peaks. After a half-hour ride, Sam showed me how to replace fence posts and left me to work alone. I found peace in the surroundings and enjoyed a quiet lunch, watching wildlife. At 4 o'clock, I finished most of the posts and discovered a tranquil pool with a waterfall on my way back. Back at the barn, Sam was impressed by my progress. After a steak dinner, I went to bed exhausted. The next morning, sore from the previous day's work, Jim suggested I join Sam for the rounds instead. Sam's deep knowledge of the land was impressive. We spotted 2 calves separated from their mothers and decided to return with horses. Jim had already saddled them, and we guided the calves back to their mothers. At night, we had another hearty dinner. Feeling more energized, I engaged in conversation and learned more about Maggie. Her parents had moved to the U.S. from Ireland when she was 5. Her father had always been fascinated by Old West stories and had come to Colorado, which explained her slight Irish accent even though she grew up in America. Her speech still carried a hint of her parents' influence. The next morning, feeling better, I returned to replacing fence posts. Sam helped me load the mules, but I worked on my own, following the stream to my work area. With the experience gained, the work was less tiring, and I finished just before 4 o'clock, leaving time to clean a few stalls before dinner. Over the next 2 months, I alternated between repairing buildings with Sam, setting up more fence posts, and checking on the cattle while riding the range. I was in the best shape of my life. We had a routine where Sam took Saturdays off, Jim took Sundays, and I had Mondays off for laundry and errands. I grew attached to everyone on the ranch. Sam was easygoing and friendly, Jim was honest and hardworking, and Maggie was kind yet had a fiery side. They were a great couple. As Friday's breakfast approached, Maggie shared that her daughter would be returning home in a week, exciting both her and Jim. Later that day, I rode through the wooded area to check for cattle and followed the stream downstream. I arrived at the pool below the waterfall, got off the horse, and cooled off by washing my face and neck with the cool stream water. A whinny from downstream caught my attention, and I turned to see a horse and rider approaching. Initially, I thought it was Maggie, but quickly realized this was a younger woman who could only be Tina, with the same striking blue eyes and red hair as her mother. She rode up and stopped a few feet away as I stood to face her, her gaze lingering on my bare chest, showing off the results of 2 months of hard work. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" she demanded, her tone haughty. "I'm Steve and I work here," I answered. "I don't believe that." "My dad said he couldn't afford to hire anyone else," she replied. Although she was stunning, her unfriendly tone was starting to irritate me. "Yeah, I heard that too." "Yes, that's why I'm laughing all the way to the bank each payday." Tina shot me a scowl, turned her horse and kicked it into a canter, disappearing from view. I chuckled, put my shirt back on, remounted my horse and continued toward the barn. Later, I discovered that Tina's parents had misunderstood her arrival date. They were expecting her next week, but she had actually arrived a couple of hours after I had left. She spent the morning and early afternoon with them, and then decided to go for a ride, something she hadn't had time for but loved. After saddling up, she rode to her favorite spot, the waterfall and pool. It seems that after 2 months, I had slipped from their minds, and Jim and Maggie had forgotten to mention me. As I rounded the barn, I saw Tina's red hair disappear inside. I dismounted and led my horse into the barn. Tina must have been searching for her father and finally found him in the barn. Her voice carried clearly as she asked, "Who is that man who was at the waterfall?" After a moment of thought, Jim replied, "That must have been Steve, but he said he works here." "Last time I visited, you told me you couldn't afford to hire anyone else," she said. "Well, he does work here, and what he's paid is none of your concern." "I still own this ranch, young lady," Jim responded. "Daddy, he says you pay him so much that he laughs all the way to the bank," Tina complained. At this point, I had entered the barn. Tina's back was to me, so she didn't see me, but Jim did and flashed me a grin. "Is that true, Steve?" "If you think you're overpaid, I can adjust that," Jim said. Tina whirled around and stared at me. I removed my hat and scratched my head. "Well, I wouldn't want to take advantage of you, Jim. How much are you thinking of cutting my pay?" I asked. Jim and I then burst into laughter. Tina, however, looked at us both with frustration, not understanding the joke. "Sweetheart, just to clear things up, Steve stays in the cabin next to Sam's," Jim explained. "And what else?" She pressed on. "That's it, and he gets to enjoy your mother's wonderful cooking," Jim added. "So you're saying he's not getting paid? Why would he work for nothing?" Tina continued to question. "He has his reasons, and it's not my place to explain," Jim said. "Working for the chance to taste your mother's cooking is valuable." "I don't think she would appreciate hearing it's nothing," I interjected. Tina shot me one last glare before storming out of the barn. Jim shook his head and said, "She reminds me so much of her mother when she was young. I didn't think I'd ever manage to tame Maggie." At dinner that evening, Tina joined us and took a seat next to Sam across from me. She gave me a sharp look when I entered the kitchen. After everyone had served themselves, I decided to speak. "I heard from your mother that you've completed your doctorate in veterinary medicine," I said in a friendly tone. "Yeah," she replied curtly without looking up. "Sam mentioned that there's only one other vet in the area who is over 50 miles away. You're going to be a valuable resource for the people here," I continued. Tina looked up briefly at the compliment, and I thought her expression softened slightly. "That's right, Dr. Harris is the other vet," Maggie said. "He's swamped with work and often needs to be in multiple places at once." "I agree with you, Steve. Our Tina will be a huge help." Throughout the rest of the meal, Tina chatted with her parents and Sam, who had been at the ranch since before she was born. She didn't speak to me directly, and I kept to myself, knowing it was her time to catch up with her family. Once I finished my meal, I excused myself and headed to bed. Back in my cabin, I checked my email and found a message from Mike. He told me he had spoken to a police friend who confirmed that they had dropped my case after receiving the email with my picture. As for Mary, Tony had left her as soon as he realized I had vanished with all the money, so Mary wasn't likely to get any of it soon. She couldn't afford the rent on our old house, and was now in a shabby apartment, working as a waitress. With no money to hire a lawyer, she couldn't pursue me. I found it ironic that she had married me for my money, and her new boyfriend had only been interested in her for the same reason. I was still working on replacing fence posts, though less frequently. Moving out of the hilly area allowed me to use a truck, making the work easier. The morning after Tina arrived, I packed the truck with posts and drove to my work site. At lunchtime, I realized I had forgotten my lunch. Deciding to skip the meal, I continued working until I heard a vehicle approaching. It was Tina in one of the ranch trucks, bringing me the lunch I had left behind. After handing me the bag, she stood nearby, watching me as I ate. When she asked why I was there, I joked about robbing a bank before admitting I needed to escape from a failed marriage. Tina seemed to understand and laughed without further comment. I reflected on Jim's earlier words about Tina resembling her mother in her younger days, and wondered if anyone could truly tame her fiery personality. Dinner that evening was similar to the previous night, with Tina chatting mostly with her parents and Sam. Toward the end of the meal, a tall, dark, and handsome man arrived at the door. Tina jumped up with excitement when she saw him, calling his name and giving him a warm hug. They clearly knew each other well and were catching up on their lives. A few minutes later, another knock came, and Jim returned with another attractive man, this one with fair hair. Tina greeted him with the same enthusiasm. Jim's comment about having to fend off every man in the area to win Maggie's affection came to mind. Tina was just as stunning as her mother, at least in terms of looks. I excused myself from the table and went back to my cabin, mentally wishing the new arrivals good luck. I envied them a bit. If Tina was anything like her mother, whoever won her heart would be very fortunate. The following day I took the pickup truck to check the range. By the end of my rounds, something seemed off. It was still early, so I went back to get Sam, and we did a quick check of the ranch. Although there were many cattle spread out, we agreed that something felt wrong. It seemed like we were missing a few animals. We decided to saddle up the next day to search the hilly areas. We discussed this with Jim at dinner, and he approved our plan. It rained that night, which would complicate tracking. The following morning, we loaded our horses into a trailer, and Jim drove us to one end of the ranch. I rode up a third of the way into the trees while Sam continued another third higher. After that, we crossed the ranch, moving over hills and through woods. It took most of the day to reach the other side. We found 5 stray cattle. Jim met us when we emerged from the hills, and we loaded the horses back into the trailer to head home. We concluded that we needed to be more watchful. During dinner that evening, another admirer visited Tina. Her mother quietly remarked that it was the furred one that day. It was clear that word had spread about Tina's return, and men were coming out of the woodwork to see her. Over the next 4 days, we kept a close watch on the herd. Everything appeared fine, except for the initial missing cattle. Tina's visitors continued to come by. She had been home for a week, but had barely spoken to me since the day she brought my lunch. On the 5th day since the cattle had gone missing, I told Jim I wanted to inspect the property line through the hills. We had already checked the fence line along the pastures without finding any signs of the missing cattle. Sam dropped me off on the west side of the ranch, where Jim's property joined the Wilson Ranch. About halfway to the southwest corner, I discovered 3 fresh sets of horse tracks crossing from the Wilson side onto Jim's land. The fence wire was still intact, which was puzzling. Dismounting, I checked the fence posts and found that the staples on 5 of them were loose and barely holding the wire. By removing the staples and lowering the wire, you could cross over, then replace the wire and staples to make it look normal. I got back on my horse and followed the tracks. Near the stream, I spotted 3 horses tied to a tree above the waterfall. Staying about 30 yards away, I quickly dismounted, tied my horse to a tree, and grabbed my rifle from its scabbard. Moving quietly through the trees, my eyes scanned the surroundings. Reaching the horses, I noticed boot prints leading downstream. Peering over the edge of the waterfall, I was stunned to see Tina in the pool, completely without clothes. I couldn't take my eyes off her as she swam through the clear water, her bare body fully exposed. A movement in the trees to Tina's right snapped me back to reality. Scanning the area quickly, I noticed 1 man to the right, and 2 more approaching the pond on the left. Raising my rifle, I fired a shot that landed between the feet of the man on the right. Another shot hit the ground between the 2 men on the left. Tina let out a terrifying scream that echoed through the forest. Standing up, I made sure everyone could see me. "Get down on your stomachs now, or I'll shoot again," I shouted. "Tina, stay where you are." Tina hadn't noticed the 3 men. All she saw was me standing above her with a rifle. "Are you out of your mind, Steve?" she yelled, trying to cover herself with one arm while keeping her other hand over her private parts. One of the men on the left flinched as if he was about to run when I fired again. The bark on the tree next to his face exploded, convincing him to drop to the ground. Tina saw where I had fired and screamed once more. I said, "Get on your stomachs." 3, 2. Before I could finish counting, the other 2 men dropped down as well. Now put your faces in the dirt and your hands behind your heads, they complied. Tina, come out of the pool and get dressed, I ordered. But Steve, she started to argue. Just damn well do what I say, get dressed and get out of here, I snapped at her. Clearly frightened, Tina was visibly shaking, but she obeyed. Emerging from the water, she stepped out like a goddess from the sea. Despite her keeping her back to me, I couldn't take my eyes off her. The sight of her pale skin and perfectly shaped backside was etched into my memory. She put on her jeans and shirt, mounted her horse, and disappeared into the trees with a swift kick. When she was gone, I instructed the men to come up the rise one by one and lie down. Only when all three were in front of me did I let out a sigh of relief. It was time to try a bluff. What should I do with you three now? I paused for dramatic effect. I could just shoot you in the groin and watch you bleed out. The men began begging for their lives, and I could smell the unmistakable odor of fear, as at least one of them soiled himself. Even if I don't kill you, Tina's father will when he hears you try to assault his daughter. The only thing that might save you is if you have something to confess to the sheriff that's more serious. Maybe you could admit to cattle rustling. It might land you in jail, but at least you'd stay alive. The smallest of the three cracked first. Yes, we did it. Wilson said if he could break Jim, he could take his land. Another man told him to be quiet. Screw you. I'm not dying for some stupid cows, the smaller guy shot back. Knowing Tina would hurry to find her father and he would come to investigate, I decided to wait. Sure enough, about 45 minutes later, both Jim and Sam appeared. I signaled them, and they quickly rode up to the top of the waterfall. What's happening here? Jim asked, his voice full of concern as he looked down at the three men lying face down. Looks like some of Wilson's men decided to drop by. I tracked them from the fence line to here. These guys were trying to sneak up on Tina while she was swimming, I said, walking over to the captives and pushing the rifle barrel against the smaller guy's neck. I think this one has something to tell you. I nudged him again. We did it. We took some of your cattle, but Wilson forced us. He sobbed. Jim tipped his hat back and grinned. You know, my grandfather used to just hang horse thieves and cattle rustlers. That seemed like real justice. Too bad we have to be all civilized these days. Sam watched the trespassers while Jim and I discussed our plan. We decided to escort them back down to the ranch. Jim and I followed behind with our rifles as the rustlers walked in front. Sam tied their horses together and brought up the rear. When we reached the barn, we put each rustler in a separate stall, but kept the doors open so we could see them, though they couldn't see each other. Jim went to call the sheriff from the house while Sam and I stayed on guard. The sheriff arrived in less than 30 minutes, speeding up the long driveway. Jim and I met him outside and explained the situation. I suggested we let the sheriff question the smaller man first, and he agreed. I quickly brought the prisoner outside. The smell made it obvious who had soiled himself. At first, the rustler was reluctant to talk, seeming to have second thoughts about his confession. Jim, it looks like we just have a case of trespassing here, the sheriff said. It's a waste of my time to deal with this. I could just leave them here and let you handle it as you see fit. The smaller rustler, now terrified, began to talk. The sheriff got the full story and called for backup. Soon a line of sheriff's vehicles began arriving at Wilson's ranch. The ranch, which was about 16,000 acres, had been pinpointed thanks to the rustlers' information. They located nearly 100 stolen cattle branded with the Rocking J. By the end of the day, Wilson and his crew were behind bars. Due to all the commotion, it was after 9 o'clock before we finally sat down for dinner. Tina was at the table but kept her gaze fixed on her plate. What were you doing up there, dear? Jim asked, not having had much chance to speak with her earlier. I was just swimming. I didn't think anyone would come and spy on me, Tina said, giving me an accusing look. Tina, I started. I wasn't spying on you. I followed the tracks of the horses to the stream and think about it. What would have happened if I hadn't been there? Those guys weren't planning to have a nice chat with you when they saw you swimming without clothes. Tina's face turned bright red. Thank goodness you arrived when you did, Steve, Maggie said. I shuddered to think what could have happened otherwise. The conversation quickly moved on as everyone ate their dinner. We had to wake up early the next morning. After leaving the kitchen, I was halfway to my cabin when Tina called out to me. I paused and waited for her to catch up. So, did you enjoy the view today? She asked, sounding irritated. It seemed she wasn't going to show any gratitude. Let's just say I'd be lying if I said it wasn't breathtaking, I replied. Tina responded with a dismissive noise and turned sharply to head back toward the house. I stood there shaking my head, thinking there must be something about me that really annoyed her. The following day, Jim had to go to town to file formal charges against Wilson. It would be several days before we could return the stolen cattle to their rightful place. The prosecutor needed to complete all the paperwork first. Sam and I spent the day repainting some of the outbuildings. Tina didn't join us for lunch, which I didn't mind. Jim returned in the early afternoon but waited until dinner to update us. He explained that since this wasn't a capital case, Wilson and his crew would be released on bail. Jim didn't expect them to cause more trouble, but he advised us to remain alert. Then he looked at Tina and grinned broadly. "If you're planning to swim without clothes again soon, you might want to bring Steve along to keep an eye on you," he joked, laughing as he teased Tina. Tina's face went red and she got flustered, kicking her chair back and quickly leaving the room. Jim and Sam burst into laughter and even Maggie chuckled. I found myself laughing too. Once things settled down, we continued eating. Jim wasn't done with his teasing though. "Steve, I truly appreciate what you did. Wilson could have really hurt the ranch financially. You're absolutely worth every cent I pay you," Jim said, and we all had a good laugh at that. 3 days later, Jim got the news that he could retrieve his cattle. We loaded 3 horses into a trailer and drove to the main gate of Wilson's property, marked as the Flying W Ranch. A sheriff's escort took us to where the stolen cattle had been held. Maggie joined us to drive the truck and trailer back after we unloaded the horses. Jim, Sam, and I began guiding the cattle back to his ranch. It felt like something out of a Western film, with us driving the herd. When we approached the Rocking J Ranch, I went ahead to loosen part of the fence so the cattle could cross. Once all the cattle were safely back on Jim's side, we fixed the fence and rode back to the main house, satisfied with our work. Tina had applied for her veterinary license, which usually took about 45 days to process. Until then, she was only able to take care of the animals on her father's ranch. I saw her around occasionally and at mealtimes. She still ignored me, but whenever I could catch her eye, I'd flash a big grin and wiggle my eyebrows, which always made her blush. 2 weeks after the waterfall incident, we happened to be in the barn at the same time. "Been swimming lately?" I asked, wiggling my eyebrows playfully. Tina walked right up to me and stared daggers. "Why do you have to be such a jerk?" She shot back. I shrugged and grinned. "And why are you such a grouch?" I replied. Her right hand started to move toward my face, but I was faster and grabbed her wrist before she could hit me. She tried to strike me with her left hand. Both of her hands behind her back, I held them there, forcing her body against mine. Slowly, I lowered my face until my lips were just an inch away from hers. Tina's eyes were wide as she watched me, but she didn't try to pull away. "If you were my woman, I'd put you over my knee and give you a spanking," I whispered. Tina gasped loudly. "You wouldn't dare," she said, trying to pull back. Suddenly, I let go and she fell backward, landing on her bottom. "It's not about daring. It's that I've just gotten rid of one woman who didn't care about me, and I'm not going to waste my time with another one," I said. Up until now, Tina had always been the one to walk away. This time, it was my turn. I walked out of the barn, leaving her sitting on the ground with her mouth open. Until supper, I didn't see her again. She didn't talk to me, but I noticed her giving me a look I couldn't quite figure out. Not that I claimed to understand women anyway. My marriage to Mary showed that. The next day, while I was cleaning out the stalls in the barn, Jim came in. Since it was Sunday and his day off, I knew he wasn't there to work. I wondered if Tina had told him about what happened yesterday, and if he was here to tell me to leave. I stopped working as he approached. "I heard you and Tina had a bit of a clash yesterday," he said. That confirmed Tina had informed her father. However, I noticed a glint of amusement in Jim's eyes. "Yeah, you could say that. It was probably mostly my fault," I admitted. "Perhaps, or perhaps not. Tina's issue seems to be that she's unsure about you. Initially she thought you were here only because you wanted something. Then you became the hero who saved both her and the ranch. What confuses her is why you aren't pursuing her like the other local guys. Tina, like her mother at her age, is used to having boys wrapped around her finger. She's had several boyfriends, but they never lasted. I don't think she had much respect for them. I just hope you don't let her drive you away. In my opinion, you're welcome to stay here as long as you want." I appreciate that, Jim. It means a lot. Regarding Tina, I'll stop teasing her, and hopefully we can just coexist, I replied. After Jim left the barn, I continued with my work. I had the rest of the day to think about what Jim had said. If Tina wanted to understand me, she should act politely and talk to me. As for chasing her like the other suitors, that wasn't going to happen. Tina skipped supper that night, but no one mentioned it, and I didn't ask. The next day I got up at 5 o'clock as usual, even though it was my day off. Sticking to the same routine made it easier for me to avoid sleeping in. After breakfast, I went to fetch my laundry after Sam and Jim had left for work. Jim had bought a large commercial washer and dryer, allowing me to do all my clothes in one load. The laundry room was next to the kitchen, so I would sit at the table and drink coffee while my clothes washed. Maggie and I were chatting at the table when Tina walked in. She usually ate breakfast at a different time. "Do you have any plans for today?" Maggie asked. "I was actually thinking of heading into town." "Do you need me to pick up anything for you?" I offered. "Well, if you don't mind, there are a couple of things I need," she replied. "Not at all," I said. "Could I come with you into town?" Tina asked. I looked up, surprised. "I was planning to go to the general store for a few things, and it seems like a waste of gas for us both to drive," she explained, as if she needed to justify her request. "Absolutely, I'd be glad to give you a ride," I said, still a bit surprised. After how things went yesterday, I didn't expect her to talk to me, let alone want to join me for a trip. "I'll be ready to leave in about an hour and a half once my laundry is finished and put away." "Great, I'll be ready," Tina replied. She finished preparing something to eat and joined us at the table, but stayed silent while Maggie and I chatted. Tina must have been keeping an eye out for me because she appeared at the back door the moment I stepped outside my cabin. She looked stunning in a turquoise sundress that matched her red hair. The dress's straps left her arms and shoulders bare, and her skin was flawless. Unlike many redheads, neither Tina nor her mother have freckles. She moved gracefully toward me, her blue eyes locked on mine, clearly making sure I noticed her. I opened the passenger door for her and watched as she slid inside. As we started driving, Tina spent the first part of the trip quietly observing the countryside. Then she suddenly said, "I thought you were going to kiss me yesterday." I glanced at her, but since she seemed to be looking out the window, I couldn't see her face. While that might not have been unpleasant, but I have a rule against imposing unwanted affection on someone who isn't receptive. I noticed her head whip around and I could tell she was staring at me. Tia remained quiet, but I saw her glance at me several times. We arrived at the general store, went inside, and I picked up a couple of new pairs of jeans and shirts. Tina had a list of items her mother needed, and an hour later, we had everything packed and ready to go. I needed to make one last stop at the hardware store to grab a few things for Jim, but it was lunchtime and I was hungry. I suggested we stop and grab a bite to eat, and Tina agreed. We pulled into the same diner where I had first met Jim and Maggie. We chose a table across from each other and ordered our meals. The silence between us made me think that maybe I should have gone to the hardware store first and then returned to the ranch. At that moment the door swung open and 3 men walked in. I recognized 2 of them as guys who had been pursuing Tina. They headed straight for our table, with 2 of them taking seats on either side of Tina, while the third stood behind me. They completely ignored me and began talking to Tina. I stood up and told the man staying to take a seat as I moved to the next table. I caught Tina's annoyed look when the waitress brought our food. I asked her to place my meal in front of me. I ate quickly, trying to ignore the conversation at Tina's table. After tossing some cash on the table to cover our meals, I got up. Tina had barely touched her food. "I'm heading to the hardware store now. I can swing back by here later to see if you're ready to go," I said, interrupting their conversation. Tina pushed her plate aside and stood up. "No, I'll come with you. It was nice seeing you guys again, but we have to go," she said. The guys at the table tried to protest, with one even offering to drive her home. She declined and followed me out to my SUV. I went to the hardware store and got out of the vehicle. Tina stayed in the car, looking frustrated. She remained upset during the drive back to the ranch, and as we turned onto the long driveway she asked, "Why did you do that?" "What do you mean?" I responded, unsure of what she was talking about. "Why did you move to the other table?" "Oh, that. I figured you'd prefer to spend time with your friends. Plus, I didn't want to be caught up in their competition for your attention." "You really are a jerk," she said sharply. I decided to stay quiet. I didn't want to deal with her slaps while driving. When I parked in front of the main house, Tina quickly grabbed as many bags as she could. I took the rest and followed her into the house. She dumped the bags on the kitchen table and walked out of the room without saying a word to her mother. Maggie looked at me puzzled. Shrugging, I said, "I guess I'm a jerk." Maggie laughed softly and placed a hand on my arm. I've never seen anyone affect Tina like you do, she said quietly. Maybe it's just my talent for annoying her, I answered. I'm not so sure about that, she replied, leaving me puzzled. After that, I returned to my cabin and put away my new clothes. Wanting some fresh air, I went to the barn, saddled a horse, and rode out to the top of the waterfall. The weather was pleasant, so I tied the horse to a tree and sat by the edge, looking down at the clear pool. I'd been sitting there for at least half an hour when Tina appeared below me on horseback. She dismounted, and to avoid being accused of spying if she decided to swim again, I picked up a stone and threw it into the water, making a splash. Tina looked around to where the noise came from and noticed me. Instead of leading, she rode up to where I was sitting, tied her horse next to mine, and walked toward me. I stepped back from the edge just in case she intended to push me off. You're such a jerk, she said, stopping just inches away from me. You're still a jerk, I said. Not waiting for her to slap me, I wrapped my arms around her waist and kissed her. Just as suddenly as I had pulled her close, I tried to move toward my horse. However, she grabbed my arm and spun me around. To my surprise, she reached behind my neck and pulled me into another kiss. Our tongues quickly intertwined, and we both breathed heavily as we finally separated. Tina looked at me with dazed eyes. Jerk, she said. Jerk, I responded. We found ourselves kissing passionately once more. Trying not to overwhelm her, I rolled to the side and pulled her into my arms as we both struggled to catch our breath. Sweat covered our bodies as our breathing slowed, and we continued to hold each other. Do you really think I'm a jerk? She asked softly. I laughed. You definitely have your moments. I'm sorry, she said gently. I looked at her fiery red hair and wondered if I had managed to change her thoughts. Memories of Jim and Maggie's love crossed my mind, and I briefly imagined a life like that with Tina. Tina suggested a swim, and we headed to the pool, still without clothes. In the cool water, we embraced and made love slowly and intimately. Afterward, we dressed in silence, rode back, and stabled the horses. Tina kissed me once more before heading to the main house, leaving me in a daze as I returned to my cabin for a hot shower, realizing my feelings for her were deeper than I had admitted. At dinner, Tina, unusually cheerful, sat next to me, surprising her parents, but raising no questions. Later, she joined me in my cabin, where we made love again before falling asleep in each other's arms. The next morning, I quietly left the cabin after giving Tina a gentle kiss. At breakfast, Jim and Maggie gave me knowing looks, hinting they might have known where Tina spent the night. I spent the day setting fence posts, reflecting on how much had changed in just 3 months since I left my wife. I realized how much Jim, Maggie, Sam, and especially Tina meant to me, wondering if I had found the kind of love her parents shared. At lunchtime, I forgot my meal again, but Tina showed up with it, running over and kissing me deeply. Mama said you forgot your lunch, she said with a laugh. Forgetting lunch was the least of my concerns, I replied, pulling her back for another passionate kiss. Although I didn't manage to set as many fence posts that day, I definitely made up for it with Tina. We took some time to talk, during which I shared details about my past and how my ex-wife had mistreated me. Tina expressed her worries that I might leave her. I'll only leave if you tell me to, I assured her. Tina eventually went back home, and I finished up my workday. After showering and changing, I headed to the kitchen, where Tina was already seated next to me. Midway through our meal, there was a knock on the front door. Jim answered it, and came back with the same guy who had previously asked Tina out. Tina stayed in her seat and looked at him. I was hoping you'd like to go for a drive, he said. In this area, going for a drive usually meant going on a date. I appreciate the invitation, Tina replied, but I don't think my boyfriend would be happy about it. She leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. The guy, looking embarrassed, mumbled something and left. It was clear to everyone that Tina and I were now an official couple. She made it known that she was no longer available, and no more local men came by. Tina needed a loan to buy equipment for her veterinary practice, but the bank only offered a secured loan, using the ranch as collateral, which she was hesitant to ask her father for. I set up an account with my offshore bank under a fake loan company name, approved her loan application, and transferred the funds to her account. Tina was thrilled, thinking it was from a non-profit organization. With her license approved, Tina bought a van and set it up as a mobile vet office. Local ranchers soon began calling her for services. Tina often stayed with me in my cabin, and Jim and Maggie didn't mind. The trial for Wilson and his crew took 3 months, with the small-time accomplice getting probation. The 5 other workers received 5-year prison sentences, and Wilson, the ringleader, got 10 years and a $50,000 in fine. After Wilson was sent to prison, I started looking into him and his ranch. He was single with no local family, and with his workers imprisoned, no one was left to manage the ranch. I came up with a new plan, but before I could act on it, I needed to finalize some old business first. I had to get a divorce, and I was determined not to let Mary take half of my money. I reached out to my friend Mike for help with this. Instead of emailing, I called him and asked him to speak to Mary on my behalf. Mike was to tell her that I wanted to offer her a settlement of $50,000 and in exchange for a divorce. If she refused the offer, she would never hear from me again and would get nothing. Initially, Mary tried to act innocent, questioning why I left and why I wouldn't come back. That changed when Mike revealed that I knew about her affair with Tony and her plans to divorce me. Realizing she was out of options, Mary accepted the settlement. Since she was still a struggling waitress, returning to Texas was necessary for me to hire a lawyer and get the divorce papers prepared. Tina wasn't happy when I told her about my trip. I assured her that closing this chapter was essential for me and promised I'd come back. Although I intended to drive to the airport and leave my car in long-term parking, Tina insisted on driving me and wanted to be there when I returned. Leaving behind my SUV and most of my belongings, taking only a suitcase, seemed to comfort her a bit. I departed on Sunday, and Mike picked me up from the airport upon arrival. I stayed with him, his wife, and their 2 kids. I made sure to call Tina every night. By Friday, I'd completed all the necessary paperwork. Mike took Mary to see my lawyer, who explained that she would receive $10,000 now, and the remaining $40,000 in 60 days after the divorce was finalized. My lawyer showed Mary the check he would hold until the judge's decision. She signed the papers and received the initial $10,000, and I never had to meet Mary in person. Then, I considered the items I had in storage, including keepsakes and heirlooms from my parents, as well as yearbooks and other sentimental belongings. Deciding that I didn't want to make another trip for them, I rented a moving van and packed it up. Tina nearly panicked when I told her I wasn't flying back. I had to reassure her, and once I explained that I was bringing back everything that mattered to me, she became excited about my return. Covering the 1,600 miles took me 3 days of intense driving. By Tuesday evening, I arrived at the Rocking J Ranch. Everyone gave me a warm and enthusiastic welcome. That night, Tina kept up the celebrations until early morning, and we finally fell asleep, both exhausted. With my plan nearly complete, I needed to visit the prison where Wilson was held. My goal was to convince him to sell me his ranch. Initially, he refused, but I persisted in presenting my case. He would be locked up for at least 7 years, even with good behavior, before being eligible for parole. Without anyone to manage his ranch, it would likely fall into disrepair. His cattle might die from neglect during the winter, and after his conviction he would likely be shunned by the local ranching community. Realizing his situation, Wilson agreed to my offer. At least this way, he would have something to start with when he got out. Finding the necessary financing was the next step. I transferred my money back into the country, confident that Mary wouldn't risk her $50,000 and by acting recklessly. I negotiated a purchase price of $4 a million with Wilson, which was below its actual value, making it easier to secure financing. I made a $500,000 in down payment and financed the remaining amount, taking a month to finalize everything. Keeping my activities a secret was challenging, but I told Tina and Jem that I had personal matters related to my assets to handle. These tasks only took a day or 2 each week. I set up a corporation and registered the land under the business name. With summer ending and fall approaching, I hired someone to harvest the hay on the property and brought in 4 workers to live on the ranch and manage it temporarily. The most skilled worker was appointed as the temporary foreman. I informed him that for a while I would be an absentee owner, though I'd be nearby. He could always reach me by phone, and I planned to visit the ranch regularly. The last part of my plan was to have the main house renovated. Although it was a 2-story, 5-bedroom home, it needed updating. Despite Tina's growing frustration with my secrecy about my activities, our relationship continued to thrive. My feelings for her deepened daily, and I sensed that she felt the same way about me. Her veterinary practice was prospering, though it required her to travel frequently, which she didn't mind. There was a moment when I almost revealed everything to her. After returning from checking on the renovation, she confronted me. "What's going on, Steve? Are you seeing someone else?" she demanded. "Absolutely not. I promise there's no one else. I have some things to handle, but I'll explain everything soon. I love you, Tina, and I'm asking you to trust me." Trust in our love, I reassured her. As she searched my face for honesty, her expression softened. Okay, Steve, I trust you. But you'd better tell me what's happening soon, or I'll kick your ass, she warned. I pulled her close and kissed her passionately. Spring had arrived, and the main house renovation was finished just in time for calving season. It was now time to execute the final part of my plan. One afternoon, I waited until I had Tina alone and asked her to join me for a drive. Sweetheart, I've been thinking it's time for me to leave the Rocking J Ranch, I told her seriously. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. But Steve, you promised you wouldn't leave, she said, her voice trembling. I had planned it so that we were at the entrance to the former Flying W Ranch, which had no sign at the gates. I turned onto the private road and drove in. I wasn't planning on going far, I explained. Tina looked around, clearly puzzled. It seemed like she might not have heard me correctly. Steve, why are we on Wilson's property? I delayed my response until we reached the main house. Come on, I want to show you something. After getting out of the truck, I went around to open her door. Taking her hand, I guided her to the front door and opened it. Steve, she whispered urgently. What are you doing? We could get into trouble. Don't worry, I reassured her. Wilson doesn't own this ranch anymore. Let's take a look around and see what you think of the house. Although Tina looked at me skeptically, she followed me inside. I showed her the upstairs bedrooms, then we went back downstairs to explore. The house had a spacious living room, a well-paneled den, 2 rooms set up as home offices, and a beautiful kitchen. Her expression lit up when she saw the kitchen. Only one room was furnished, and that was the one I planned to use for my office. The rest of the house was open for her to decide what she wanted. What do you think of the house? I asked her. It's really nice, she replied. Do you think you could live here? Steve, what's going on? Her confusion and frustration were evident. Dropping to one knee, I reached into my jacket pocket. Tina, Wilson no longer owns this ranch. I do. I'm asking if you could live here. Could you live here as my wife? You own this? She asked, astonished. Yes. I nodded, pulling out the engagement ring. I held it up. Tina, I love you with all my heart. Will you marry me? Her face scrunched up, and tears welled in her eyes. At first I feared I'd made a mistake, but then she threw herself at me, covering my face with kisses. Yes, Steve. Yes, I'll marry you, she exclaimed. Our next kiss was full of passion. Tina then extended her finger so I could place the ring on it. She looked around the house with a new perspective, darting from room to room to take everything in. I waited patiently until she ran back into my arms. This house is stunning. I absolutely love it, she said with excitement. I guided her across the room to 2 doors leading off a hallway. Here are 2 offices. One is for your business, and the other is for me. That prompted another passionate kiss from her. I took her into the office with the desk and revealed a large piece of paper. It displayed a drawing of a property gate with Doubles Ranch written across it. Tina examined it closely, her expression puzzled. What does a doubles mean? She inquired. It stands for Steve and Tina Ranch, I clarified. Understanding dawned on her face. Oh my God, that's perfect, she exclaimed. As she started pulling at my clothes, I joined her in undressing. Once we were both without clothes, I placed her on the desk, and we made love, christening the office with our affection. In the following days, we enjoyed each other in every room of our new home. After we had dressed and recovered, I told Tina it was time to inform her parents. She was so overjoyed that she almost floated to the truck. We arrived back just after 6 o'clock, and Jim, Maggie, and Sam were already in the kitchen preparing supper. We entered together, and Tina proudly displayed her left hand. We're getting married, she announced with a squeal. Maggie immediately jumped up to hug her daughter, while Jim and Sam shook my hand and gave me hearty pats on the back. I received a big hug from my future mother-in-law as Tina embraced her father and Sam. Once things settled down, we all sat down to eat. Tina waited until everyone was served. Of course, this means we'll be moving, she said as casually as she could. What? Jim, Maggie, and Sam exclaimed in unison. Tell them, sweetheart, Tina urged me. I nodded. Well, Jim, you know how Wilson wanted to merge his ranch with yours. I thought it could be a good opportunity. Jim stood up, furious. There's no way the Flying W is going to take over my ranch, he roared. I chuckled. Jim, relax. It's not the Flying W anymore. It's now the Doubles Ranch, and the new owners are right here at your table. What are you talking about? He yelled, looking completely baffled. I bought Wilson out. The ranch now belongs to Tina and me, I clarified. Double S, Steve and Tina, Maggie said, quickly grasping the situation. Jim, I thought if we merged the two ranches you could manage them. We'd split the profits equally, I continued. But the Flying W, I mean Double S, is more than twice the size of my ranch and generates much more profit, he responded. Jim, you've been doing this your whole life. I need your expertise. I'd like us to be equal partners, with you overseeing operations. Your decisions will be final. Besides, Tina has a stake in it too. This way, everything stays within the family, I explained. Jim took a seat and looked at Maggie, who nodded in agreement. He extended his hand across the table to me and we shook on the deal. Damn it, Steve, this is going to be a big adjustment, but I accept your offer. This means we'll need more help, so Sam will become the head foreman, I said. Then I groaned. And I'll have to remove all those fence posts I spent so much time setting up on that side of the property. Everyone laughed at my expense. That night's dinner turned into a lively celebration. Tina stayed over at my cabin, and we had an exhausting but wonderful time. We slept in the next morning, but everyone was still in the kitchen when we arrived. They were eager to head over to the Double S and see Tina's new home. Everyone was impressed, and I noticed Maggie eyeing the newly renovated kitchen with envy.